The idea that some people seem to think that because we've got this rebate agreement in place, it doesn't matter what the NICE threshold is. It does, because there is exemption from any rebate in the first 3 years. Even then, it's not 100% tax rate. And the other bad thing about giving industry more money through the NICE threshold is it very badly distorts incentives. It incentivizes, it over rewards those drugs that impose NHS costs much more than those drugs that reduce them. So it directly undermines the objectives in the 10-year plan for the NHS. The reason why we wrote the letter is because our work shows that that will be an absolute catastrophe for all NHS patients, for users and the informal carers of those in receipt of social care. And it will also be a disaster for growth in the local economy. And we have the body of causal evidence that can demonstrate that impact. Yeah, so that paper in the BMJ called NICE's Social Value Judgments is where it all came from. And Rawlins and Collier kind of basically said, well, what's been implied by the choices is, you know, they say yes below 20, they always say no above 30, it's somewhere in that space, right? As members of the original appraisal committee, we were really unhappy both with those numbers and the fact that it was made public, and we weren't that happy that it ended up being baked into 2004 methods guide. But that's where it comes from. It means nothing. It's just what NICE does, right? It's ended up getting embedded into agreements around VPAG, but hey, it's just a made-up number.
Karl Claxton has issued a clear warning to the UK Prime Minister. The proposed changes to pharmaceutical pricing could have serious consequences for NHS patients. Yet the issue has received almost no public attention. The government is navigating significant economic, political, and international pressures, while the public has limited visibility into the trade-offs that are being considered. There's no impact assessment and no clear explanation on the potential effects. This raises a key question. What level of change in healthcare access or quality is acceptable in the pursuit of a sustainable approach to pharmaceutical pricing, and who should make that decision? With that in mind, I hope you enjoy my conversation with Professor Claxton, where we explore his perspective on what fair drug pricing in the UK could look like. Amazing. Thank you for joining me today, Karl, here on the podcast. I really appreciate you taking the time. There's a couple of things I wanted to discuss with you today, but before we get into that, do you want to just take a quick second to introduce yourself, say who you are and why people should listen to you?
Okay, so my name is Karl Claxton, Professor of Economics at the University of York. Taught the Master's programme here for, it's got to be 20 years. Taught over 1,000 students. And now I work full-time in the Centre for Health Economics. I lead a couple of research teams. The research team that I think the output of the research team we're going to talk about today is looking at the marginal productivity or the marginal benefits we get for changes in NHS and social care expenditure. I guess the other relevant thing is I was a founding member of the NICE Appraisal Committee back in 1999. I was involved with NICE until 2012-13, involved in all the methods update. In 2015, I published a paper in Health Economics, which was my public declaration of war on NICE. It's been thoroughly captured as an institution. That pretty much summarises me. Yeah.
Amazing, perfect. Thanks, Karl. So maybe I'll say this: you've just written an open letter to the UK Prime Minister and to the UK government. Do you just want to give us a bit of context? What was the reason for you doing that? What's you're criticising certain things? Why did you write that letter?
Yeah, I think we wrote that letter, as people probably know, behind the scenes, there are negotiations around how much more the NHS is going to pay for new pharmaceuticals, and the pressure has been building on government. It built when the sector walked out of negotiations in August to try and find a settlement. Following that, there was a number of declarations of withdrawal of investment by various companies. There was then a tsunami of CEOs saying what a terrible place the UK was. We then had Lord Valence, our Minister for Science, the previous scientific advisor, and previously, of course, President of Research and Development at GlaxoSmithKline, saying that we should increase expenditure from 9 to 14%. And then we had Thomas Phillipson, who was previously Donald Trump's chair of the Council of Economic Advisors, saying we should increase the amount we spend to a certain proportion of GDP per capita. So there's a huge amount of pressure being put on internally and also externally, with the threat of tariffs. Currently we're tariff free, but the US negotiator is arriving in the UK on Monday, and we believe that there is a lot of pressure to get a deal done, because Trump has made it very clear, it's no secret, it's kind of out there in black and white. Trump has tried to do a deal to get cheaper domestic US prices, quite right, prices are too high in the United States, in return for using US power in terms of trade negotiations, tariffs and threats of tariff to make sure that the rest of the world pays more and makes up that difference. So that's kind of where we are. The reason why we wrote the letter is because our work shows that will be an absolute catastrophe for all NHS patients, for users and the informal carers of those in receipt of social care, and it will also be a disaster for growth in the local economy. And we have the body of causal evidence that can demonstrate that impact. We wrote the letter because there is no publicly available impact assessment of the things that are currently being considered by government, and we felt that that has to be put in place. And we wrote publicly because we strongly believe that people need to understand what is on the table when decisions have been made on their behalf. So that's kind of where we are. Is it difficult to get this story out in the media? Yes. Is it difficult to get backbench MPs to take this up? Yes. Why is that? I will let your viewers speculate on the possible routes by which a very important story is not getting out. And that's why I'm here.
Perfect. Amazing. So just to maybe put that into a bit more context as well, I think the current proposals that are being discussed at the minute, from what I've seen in the media, is a 25% raise in the NICE willingness to pay threshold. So that seems to be one of the big sort of headlines that's flying around. Again, currently still it's just rumors, it's nothing has been settled, but this is effectively what would create a shift towards the drug pricing environment in the UK.
Well, it would be that combined with a reduction in the level of rebate paid through the VPAG, the voluntary agreement that's currently in place. So those two things together increase NHS costs. The idea that some people seem to think that because we've got this rebate agreement in place, it doesn't matter what the NICE threshold is. It does, because there is exemption from any rebate in the first 3 years. Even then, it's not 100% tax rate. And the other bad thing about giving industry more money through the NICE threshold is it very badly distorts incentives. It incentivizes, it over rewards those drugs that impose NHS costs much more than those drugs that reduce them. So it directly undermines the objectives in the 10-year plan for the NHS. So, if you're going to do a damn silly thing, don't do it in the most damn silly way. And the most damn silly way to do a damn silly thing is to increase the NICE threshold. The less damn silly thing to do is to only reduce the rebate. The less damn silly thing is to get Treasury to pay this bill. But whichever way it's done, it's still a damn silly thing. And that, I mean, calling it silly, it's kind of, calling it a damn silly thing is kind of an insult to the scale of the consequences we're going to feel.
So you speak about the changes that might bring to the pricing environment in the UK, and how that would affect effectively the prices that pharmaceutical companies would be able to achieve if the willingness to pay threshold gets raised here. I think some of the sources you quote in your open letter, they refer to the long-term value of a pharmaceutical product, and I believe is you make out that sort of like 20%. 20% of that value should go to pharmaceutical companies as like a fair share for their efforts of developing the drug and so forth. Explain to me, like, what is that concept about? Like, how can you calculate the lifetime value of a pharmaceutical, and why is it 20% the right number of that value that should go to the pharma companies?
Sure. This goes back to two papers published in Health Economics, led by my colleague Beth Woods. The first one asked the question, well, what share of long-term value do we currently pay? And that was motivated by questions around how should we pay for antimicrobials, because there we need an upfront payment, right? Because we don't want to use them. So to start to answer that, we asked the question, well, what proportion of the share of long-term value do we currently pay? That piece of work suggested that in most cases we pay more than 100%. And so that it poses the next question, which is, well, what should the share be? And that's the most recent paper in Health Economics on dynamic efficiency. And there we looked at the causal evidence of how the quantity of innovation responds to the amount of reward. And if we imagine that the NHS is the whole world, or the whole world acts together, if we take account of that evidence, it looks like about 20% is the overall reward we should give. In terms of the long-term value, I think we can do that based on NICE assessment. Effectively, if we have a pricing system which benchmarks new brands to generic versions of older brands, then any incremental health gain we get from the original brand gets baked in. We keep getting that benefit, even when that old branded drug that became generic has never been prescribed. So I think it's a very generous way to industry of thinking about what that long-term value looks like. Now, of course, we're talking about long-term value, so we need to think about, okay, will the incidence change over time? If it's growing over time, then of course the value is greater in the future. That was the case with the antimicrobial work. If it's declining, then the value in the future is worth less, and of course we need to discount it. And discounting is a whole another podcast, and I'm very happy to do that. So this is not something that's beyond us. And in fact, I remember Thomas Phillipson and Lakdawala publishing a piece in Health Affairs many years ago talking about what proportion of long-term value healthcare systems got from the HIV drugs. Now, their estimates were industry got next to nothing. Well, their analysis was profoundly flawed because they picked a number in terms of the value of the QALYs gained, and they completely ignored the health opportunity costs. But they were willing to look at long-term value. So I think industry should welcome the fact that people like me, who I don't think are seen as particular friends to industry, are saying, we should account for long-term value beyond patent expiration. Absolutely. Many from industry have been saying that for a long time, and we agree. Yes, you should. But you should only pay 20%. Depending on what you think, okay. If you think the elasticity on quantity of innovation to payment is higher than we think a reasonable essential estimate would be, then sure, you're going to pay more, maybe 30%.
Right, okay.
But you're not going to pay 100%, and we're currently paying more than 100%.
Okay, so let's say it's 20 to 30%. I mean, I want to touch on a different point, because you've already sort of like we're talking about it, and you were saying you're probably not the closest friend to industry with some of the proposals you put out there.
Oh, don't put words in my mouth. I didn't say I'm not the closest friend to industry. I said I think I am perceived not to be a close friend of industry, and those are two very different things. I'm actually trying to save the pharmaceutical sector. That's the truth, actually. That is the truth.
But why does that perception then stick around? Why do people perceive you as a bit of an enemy of the industry? Or why may they perceive you as an enemy?
I think because I'm trying to save the industry from itself. It's had a business model that effectively rests on investing huge amounts of money to create products which are then sold at prices that are unsustainable and unaffordable globally. Now, changing that, I don't blame industry for that at all. Industry has simply responded to the incentives that have been offered in the United States and across the rest of the world. They have just fulfilled their responsibilities to their shareholders and investors, and I wouldn't expect anything else. It's not a moral question. But I guess what I'm arguing for is to organise healthcare and make decisions around healthcare and rewards to innovation in a way that's consistent with what those healthcare systems need. And given where we are now, that is an uncomfortable transition for the sector. I think that transition can be made sensibly and in an evidence-based way, or it can be made with a big crash. And in a way, that's what I see from Trump. So all of a sudden, quite rightly, the United States needs to get serious about domestic drug prices. But how? Doing it this way? Reference pricing? That's not good for industry. That's not good for industry. Okay, so at the minute the deal is reference pricing for the United States, but we'll force the rest of the world to make up the difference. Well, maybe you won't get the rest of the world to make up the difference, in which case all you've got is reference pricing in the United States, and you don't have the opportunity to price discriminate across the rest of the global market. That's a disaster for industry. So it's not just a disaster for industry, it's a disaster for all of us. There'll be less appropriate reward, and there'll be less appropriate and affordable innovation than there otherwise would be. So I am the friend of industry. I am trying to save the global pharmaceutical sector single-handed, honestly.
Okay. So then if people were to listen more closely to you, what is your proposal? I know you've thrown out different numbers for changing the willingness to pay. I believe you've said in the past that it's sort of too high, that the 20 to 30k range that is currently being applied by NICE, by some of the work that you've been doing on some of the QALYs that are, or the value of one QALY that the NHS can generate with its existing services. I think the £15,000 per QALY threshold is often thrown around. What would you propose if you had all the power in the world? You could change the UK pharmaceutical system, how drugs are appraised altogether. What would you do?
Okay. Well, first of all, let's distinguish between three very different numbers. Okay. There's the NICE threshold, which is whatever NICE chose it to be in 2004, and it was based on a paper by Rawlings and Collier, and it simply reflected what NICE, my committee, had done over the previous 5 years. They actually got that number wrong, but hey, it's just a number, right?
Just so that I understand that historical context, was it just the threshold that was applied by like the very first appraisals ever done, and then it was like an average out of that, or?
Yeah, so that paper in the BMJ called NICE's Social Value Judgments is where it all came from. And Rawlings and Collier kind of basically said, well, what's been implied by the choices is, they say yes below 20, they always say no above 30, it's somewhere in that space, right? As members of the original appraisal committee, we were really unhappy both with those numbers and the fact that it was made public, and we weren't that happy that it ended up being baked into 2004 methods guide. But that's where it comes from. It means nothing. It's just what NICE does, right? It's ended up getting embedded into agreements around VPAG, but hey, it's just a made-up number. The other number is what the Treasury, in its Green Book guidance to impact appraisals, says health is worth in terms of consumption, how much consumption they think private individuals are willing to give up for health, and that's about £70,000. Do I think it's the right number? No. Is it based on the best evidence? No. But that is the number in the Treasury Green Book. If it ain't 70, it's probably not that much less than that, but hey, let's say it's 50. Okay, and then there's another number, and that number is not an opinion. That number is an empirical question of how productive is the NHS in generating health? And that's the number that we've been trying to estimate now using 16 years worth of expenditure and outcome data. We've got 6 publications on that very topic across a range of peer-reviewed journals. Now, what does that number tell us? It tells us that something less than £10,000 of NHS expenditure will get you one quality adjusted life year on average across the NHS. That work's also telling us that in geographical areas of high mortality, you get more than that in terms of health. In other words, changes in NHS expenditure generate a lot of health, and they also reduce health inequalities. There's one final number, which is £15,000 per QALY. That is the number the Department of Health and Social Care use at the moment in their impact assessments when thinking about what are the health consequences of additional healthcare costs. Is it too high? Yes. Our most recent work suggests that it's somewhat less than £10,000 per QALY. And I don't think, we've been ridiculed, particularly by those whose primary interest is the future of the pharmaceutical sector. We've been ridiculed about that number. We shouldn't be surprised about that number. A lot of what the NHS does is really cost effective. When you look at the cost effectiveness of a lot of stuff the NHS could do but doesn't, in other words, all those long waits for elective surgery, the cost per QALY is really low. So what is this telling us? It's telling us that how much it costs to produce a QALY, given the current funding of the NHS, is really low, and especially compared to how much the Treasury thinks one QALY is worth. Now, what is that telling us? Is there a conflict? No. It's telling us that the NHS is underfunded to some considerable extent with respect to the values Treasury think are appropriate. Now, I think if you said that to anybody in the street or the checkout person in Lidl when you do your shopping, they'd agree. It ain't rocket science. Okay, there's a lot of econometrics that lies behind it, a lot of issues about identification, blah, 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 but it's simple.
So I like to understand that research a little bit better, because I've looked at the paper that I think it was initially published in 2015, wasn't it? That came up with that, I think, that willingness to pay number that was just under £13,000 per QALY, 12,900 and something for the value of how the NHS is able to produce one QALY. How did you come up with that number? What's the underlying research for that? How does it work? Because that seems like such a difficult question to answer, right? Like how do you make that connection?
It's not. Let's be really clear. That 2015 paper does not estimate a willingness to pay for a QALY. It estimates what the NHS actually delivers with more or less money. Now, that paper was funded by the Medical Research Council, after NICE requested that research to be tendered for. We happened to win the tender and we did that piece of research, and we looked at 3 years of expenditure and outcome data. Since then, we've looked at another 16 years of expenditure and outcome data with 6 publications in highly respected peer-reviewed papers. But everybody seems to want to go back to the 2015 paper, and I'm very happy to talk about it. It's not the easiest paper to read. It's an HTA report. We were under, as you can imagine, a lot of scrutiny, and it's encyclopedic. The more later papers are papers in journal and you can read them. And if you want to find a really accessible summary, then please go and read our response in Health Policy, published in 2014 to, hold on a minute, Sampson and Cookson. So anybody that doubts the credibility and wants to understand more in a digestible form about our work, I would strongly recommend you reading Sampson and Cookson's commentary, both members of the Office of Health Economics. They're not on my Christmas card list, and their criticism of our most recent analysis of NHS data. And then read our response and make up your own mind. And if you're in any doubt, go to the original papers. They're all referenced in our response. Before you do that, just so you kind of, if you're not an econometrician, we've got a lay summary of this work with all the references, and it explains it in lay terms. And let me try and do it right now. We take the variation in expenditure and outcomes across the NHS. In other words, what we try and do is to look at differences in spend and outcome and control for all the other reasons why there might be differences across these geographical areas. All the observed differences. So we've got loads of controls. But we also understand that there are differences that we can't necessarily observe. And we also understand that when outcomes are bad in a particular area, we tend to spend more money. Right? So there's reverse causality. So what do? Well, we need to find instruments that predict expenditure but are unrelated to outcome. Since 2019, we have used instruments that are based on elements of the funding formula which are exogenous in the sense that they're not directly related to outcome. So, and that wasn't something we invented. Andrews and Sutton invented that back in 2015. And thank you very much to them. We've been using that approach ever since. So we believe that given the data we've currently got available, we've got the best and most robust causal evidence of the effect of NHS spend on mortality. Should we just end it there? It's just an effect on mortality. Well, to do so would be to imagine that although we can estimate an effect of NHS spend on mortality, it has no effect on survival or quality of life. And that would be insane. That would not be a plausible assumption. So yes, we do have to make an assumption, which is that our estimated effect of expenditure on the mortality burden of disease can be applied to measures of a more complete measure of health burden, namely QALY burden. And that's what we do. Has that been examined? Yes. Did a massive elicitation project. Guess what? It was also criticised in the journal by people who work for the Office of Health Economics. And guess what? There's also a reply. So if you're interested in that, read the reply.
Okay, perfect. So just so that I understand it correctly then, does that work, that work you did in 2015, does that have implications for what the actual NICE willingness to pay threshold should be, that 20 to 30k range? Should that be changed? Because I know that recently a lot of authors have picked up on that work I think you did back then, and they sort of used that. I think they made it up to, they rounded it to 15k, and they used that value to then make the argument, okay, for all the positively reimbursed NICE drugs, the average ICEs are, I think, £28,000 per QALY, and then compare that against the one QALY that can be generated within the NHS for £15,000, basically saying it's all a loss. There's a massive net loss of QALYs if you compare those two numbers.
Okay, I think the reason why people are using 15 is because we can reference that to what the Department of Health and Social Care use in their impact assessments, which was indeed not based just on our 2015 paper, but on all the work we did since then. Paper published in 2019 and then 2018. You know, there's a long list of papers, right? So, is 15 reasonable? No, it's not. Most of our most recent work suggests that it's much lower than that. And actually, the cost per QALY that the NHS is generating is lower and got lower over recent times. Is that surprising? I don't think it is. What have we seen? We've seen increasing healthcare need and a slowing in the growth of real healthcare expenditure. In other words, the discrepancy between how much society values what the NHS produces and how much it costs has widened. NHS underfunding has grown. So, do I think 15 is the right number to use? No, I don't. I think a much better number would be 10 or lower. So, in terms of that work that's looked at the net harms, they're underestimating the net harms. Now, you're asking me what the NICE threshold should be. Remember that's a different thing, right? That's a different thing. So what should the NICE threshold be? Well, personally, you asked me earlier on what my fix would be. I'll tell you what my fix would be. I don't think there is no single threshold which NICE can apply which will deliver 20% long-term value. There will be some technologies which are more valuable in the future because we need to retain them, like, for example, antimicrobials. In which case, if we're going to try and reward manufacturers through the NICE process, the cost per QALY we should apply should be 60, 70, 80,000 pounds in order to give them 20% during patent. For other things, maybe for chronic diseases, where there's a high prevalent patient population, actually maybe the threshold's really low. 4, 3, 2. So the work that we've done is telling me something really, I think, quite important. That bodies like NICE and HTA bodies are given the task of two things: an independent and accountable assessment of the evidence of long-term costs and benefits. That they do pretty well. I have my criticisms of NICE, to be honest, on that score. I think it's been weakened. And it's been weakened because they've been asked to do another job, which is to say yes or no at a particular price, or de facto negotiate prices. But they haven't been given the tools to do that job. And those two roles are in direct conflict with each other. So, what's the solution? Instead of thinking about cost per QALY thresholds and willingness to pay for bodies like NICE, forget about all that. All we need to know is, what do we believe the long-term value of this new technology is going to be at manufacturing costs? What is 20% of that value? And how much can we afford to pay for that? What's 20% of that value in terms of health, and how much can we afford to pay for that? And that gives you a number of how much the healthcare system needs to give manufacturers in reward for their efforts. How you deliver that? There's lots of different ways. And messing around with prices probably isn't a very sensible one. My solution is to modify our current framework of rebate, national rebate across portfolio. But instead of a rebate being based on caps on expenditure, it's a rebate based on the discrepancy between how much they want to charge for their product, pick any price you want, pick a global price, we don't care, and how much we can afford to pay. In other words, we use that rebate system to make sure manufacturers get their reward and to make sure that it's affordable for us, and do so in a way that protects them from reference pricing and parallel trade in the rest of the world. So that's my solution. I've been advocating for that solution since 2016. Ironically, not ironically actually, quite sensibly, it was the ABPI that asked me to work that up into a policy brief, which I did. And I took it to the Department of Health and I took it to NHS England. And there was some interest at the time. But there was a worry that industry would buy the idea of a rebate with a mechanism, so we can link it to a mechanism of early uptake, because basically, once we know we're getting a rebate, we can basically say to prescribers, you know what, this new stuff, where they've agreed to pay a rebate, it's free to you. We'll reimburse you at any price you pay, right? We make new branded drugs free at the point of use. And I think there was a worry that that would mean expenditure would get out of hand, because I think there was a lack of trust between the centre and industry, that they would push for a higher threshold that didn't represent true opportunity costs, and there would be overprescribing. I think all those things can be fixed. So that's the solution I'd like to see. Forget about, let's have de-linked payments. The OHE gave a prize to de-linked payments, and I agree, de-linked payments are a damn good idea. The only problem with de-linked payments today is you don't know what the D-link payment should be. And I think our work shows you exactly what it should be. So let's do that. Let's do that. Let's advocate for a global system of price discrimination. And I think actually rebate systems globally are the way to allow global price discrimination. It's the way that the sector's going to maximise revenue for their innovations without destroying healthcare systems. So I think the sector needs to decide whether they really want, I think for too long, the people at the very top of these pharmaceutical companies are increasingly out of touch with the people who actually do the work, and particularly the people that understand pricing and reimbursement. There's a disconnect between these two. The people at the top only care about shareholder value. And unfortunately, investors and shareholders are stupid. We know that. We know that from 2010. They're continuing to pile money in when the people in those companies know that it is increasingly difficult to sell this stuff. We've got to fix it, or else it's going to be a crash. A big crash.
So under your approach then, which I think is interesting, that because I think oftentimes people will misattribute a lot of your work to just, the 15K, 13K, 10K, whatever that number is, and just say like, oh, this should be the new willingness to pay threshold. So you saying that, no, that's actually not what you're proposing, I find very interesting. But with the rebate mechanisms you're proposing, wouldn't there still need to be some sort of budget cap in place that regulates how much of as a percentage of our overall healthcare budget gets attributed towards pharmaceuticals? Is that would we still not need to have a certain cap where we say we're willing to spend that much, and then 10-15%, whatever the right number is?
Okay, I think if I'm not saying we don't have any price mechanism, we do. We need to compare the benefits to how much we can afford to pay for them. In other words, an empirical estimate right now of how much we can afford to pay for that benefit. And that's an empirical estimate, right? It's not about what NICE thought in 2004. It's not to be politically gerrymandered one way or the other. So we do need an independent assessment of how much the NHS can afford to pay. Now, if that is really evidence-based and we really believe that it reflects what health opportunity costs are going to be, then it's kind of cool. Insofar as we get a lot more innovations, we can pay a lot more. It's fine. I don't want to put any cap on the proportion of health expenditure we pay for new pharmaceuticals or some arbitrary proportion of GDP per capita. If we get good innovations that are highly beneficial, then for sure we're going to pay more, but we're going to pay 20% of value. That's what we're going to pay. And if that means healthcare expenditure on pharmaceuticals rises, I've got no problem with it.
But under this approach, wouldn't it just like shift the discussion about the things people are then arguing about? Because right now people are arguing about cost effectiveness and all the different little parameters in the model. Everything's getting tweaked. The pharma companies, they optimize, they you can say they're cherry picking the parameters. The ERG on the other side, they're the most conservative. That's sort of like, it often feels very biased in a way as well. The truth probably somewhere in the middle. But wouldn't that your proposal just shift the debate when you say 20% of the lifetime value of a pharmaceutical? Then people would just argue about that. What should be the appropriate value of the lifetime value of a pharmaceutical? And it would just shift from cost effectiveness arguments to however you want to calculate that lifetime value.
Listen, we're never going to avoid the arguments, but I think we can recast them in a more productive way. So the first argument is what can be appropriately sorted out by an HTA process with all the checks and balances, accountability, appeals process, possibly even judicial review. And that is about marshalling the evidence. And there's lots of arguments about that. I mean, believe me, I was on NICE Appraisal for 12, 13 years. I know there's arguments, right? But once we've got through that process and we've got an agreed estimate, then we need something else, which is okay. Well, we actually need three things. We need an agreement about what the appropriate share is. And again, that's an empirical question. based on the econometric evidence. And maybe we can improve on that. But let's say we've done that. And let's say it's 20%. The third thing we need is a clear, empirical, independent understanding of how much it costs the NHS to deliver one QALY, or how much health is lost as a consequence of additional healthcare expenditure. And that needs to be evidence-based, positive, empirical question, not something that can be dialed up and down depending on who's got the loudest voice. So if we can do that, and I think we can, I guess my vision is there's kind of the equivalent of a monetary policy committee, right? That looks at all the evidence and says, look, this is the best estimate today. And those estimates will be updated. And sometimes they're going to go down insofar as the NHS is increasingly underfunded. Sometimes they might go up insofar as we start to increase real expenditure on the NHS in a way that more than keeps pace with growing healthcare need and the improved effectiveness of medicine more generally. So I'm not saying that this is just all of a sudden there's no arguments. Of course there are arguments. But let's make sure those arguments are focused on real things that can be then subject to proper scrutiny against the evidence. And let's have some checks and balances. Let's make sure these processes cannot be hijacked by one side or another, right? Industry's worried that there might be some kind of monopsony power, although I don't see any evidence of it. I don't see any evidence over all the years that I've worked in this field that government has ever been able to exercise its monopsony power. It has been on its back foot, always on its back foot. Nonetheless, we should have processes that mean that, people don't gerrymander it from either one way or the other, and that can give confidence to global pharma, whether they're based in the UK or not, to think carefully about whether certain investments make sense. And the key thing here is not all investments are worthwhile. I mean, I'm a health economist, but shareholders understand this. Not all investments are worthwhile, either before you make the investment or after you make the investment. Sometimes you win, sometimes you lose. Sometimes you need to make a difficult choice that this investment's worthwhile, but you know what, this one isn't.
Interesting. So, I mean, as part of like the 3-step process there that you just discussed, the first step was that you said there obviously still needs to be a value assessment. There needs to be scrutiny of the clinical evidence via an HTA, and all of that is already in place with the NICE process. In that context, do you think that the way, regardless of all the thresholds that are being used, but do you think that the NICE process, how's currently being implemented, is that a fair and objective process, or are there things that you would change about this? And I'm saying this because, one, I've got my own view of, like, I've gone through a couple of NICE appraisals myself as the company representative, and I also hear things obviously from other people working in the industry. And I feel like that the feeling right now for what it means to go through a NICE appraisal process is just everyone's not happy. Let's just put it that way. And I think there's a lot of concern that it's just not a fair and objective process, and it's basically just an extension of a price negotiation process, and not really has to do much with the evidence anymore.
Okay, I totally agree. I think nobody's happy. The NHS certainly isn't happy, because when NICE says yes, it has no choice but to buy this stuff, and it can't afford it. But industry's not happy either. It's having to jump through loads of hoops. It's an adversarial process. I think the reason why we're all not happy is because NICE has been given 2 jobs to do which conflict. That independent, calm, evidence-based assessment of evidence versus making a decision. And those 2 things NICE is very bad at the latter. It used to be very good at the former. But what's happened is that because back in the day, they said NICE guidance has a funding mandate, which I opposed on the committee at the time. NICE has become the primary route to market access. So it has been put under huge pressure. That pressure has had a backwash into the appraisal process. It's also had a backwash into the type of guidance NICE issues. When NICE issues guidance now, it is highly redacted. It is completely useless to clinical practice. It is an ex post justification of what they did. That needs to change. NICE guidance should be directly relevant and important to clinical practice. That's the way we used to write it, but we don't anymore. Now, for me, once we do that and we separate these two functions out, we can have really good process, we can have really good guidance, and what I'd really like to see is that actually that guidance is no longer single technology. Another thing that was introduced while I was still a committee member, which was a total disaster. It was introduced because of political pressure to make sure we got Herceptin through for early stage breast cancer. That's why it was introduced. It was introduced in a matter of weeks in order not to upset the politicians and not to approve the HER2 regime. That needs to change, in my opinion. I think we should be doing appraisals, proper appraisals, which look at all the alternatives available to a patient with a particular diagnosis at a particular point in their disease history. And that will be much more useful for the NHS. It'll be much more, I think it'll be a better process actually for industry. It's going to improve our evidence base, it's going to improve health outcomes, and also you're going to end up with a fairer process. So I agree. I think, the consequences of this long-term political failure to have a proper pricing mechanism that is independent of assessment has a whole load of backwash.
I've got two follow-up questions on that. I think the first one is more closely tied to what you just said about the proposal for, how I understood it, more like an indication-based sort of appraisal process, regardless of line of therapy. You're not just looking at one drug, but you're sort of looking at everything combined. Is that? Yeah. Okay.
That is the way we always did it until STA came in, and we produced useful, good evidence that could be directly written into clinical guidelines. I mean, the way I see it is for me, the only thing that actually matters for the NHS is the clinical guidelines work. The TA process has become this kind of de facto price negotiation kind of shadowlands. But NICE doesn't really have the tools. And then if you've got some arbitrary budget impact above 20 million, then, there's another round of negotiations. I mean, basically it's broken. And we've tried to put patches on it, right? We tried to put STA, wider social benefits, like that's going to fix it. Budget impact, like that's going to fix it. VPAG, like that's going to fix it. None of it fixes it. But connecting proper appraisal to rebates, not paid per product, because there are limits to that. I understand that because of, reference pricing, etc. But rebates at a portfolio level to do our best to effectively hide the transaction price, then maybe we can get this to work and maybe it will save the sector.
Okay. And when you look at other countries that are doing HTA, do certain countries stand out to you? Something where you say, oh, they're just doing it much better, something that we can learn from, for example? Or do you think nobody's quite cracked it yet?
I think the country or the proposal that came as close as possible to cracking it was the Patent Medicines Price Review Board in Canada, which took up this idea about rebates that reflect a discrepancy between any old price you want to charge and what we can afford. And as long as you can show that, in effect, whatever rebate system you're involved in across the provinces, it gets us to that, then great, we're going to approve you. If not, we're not going to approve you. And if you refuse to launch in Canada, this is really important, if you refuse to launch in Canada and your post-rebate price is more than sufficient for you to manufacture the product without making a loss, we will take that to be non-action of your patent and we will compulsory license for production in Canada. Now, that's as close as we got to something sensible. The threat of compulsory license, if you refuse to launch, but you could manufacture and deliver for that post-rebate price, I think is very important. It would never need to be done more than once.
Okay. I mean, I'm looking through my list of questions now. We're almost out of time as well. Is there any last sort of like points you wanted to make? Any sort of like takeaway? I've got one final question for you for sure, but anything that you think we haven't quite covered yet that you wanted to raise?
No, I think well, other than thinking that the ISPOR flour is going to save you, it's not. It's not. Every petal you put on the ISPOR flour is a petal on the opportunity cost side. The more petals you put on, the more we'll estimate what we lose. It's not. Forget about the ISPOR flour. It won't save you.
Okay, perfect. Last question then. Do you think that you'll get a response from the Prime Minister about your open letter? Do you think you'll actually start a meaningful conversation about this, or will it just be the letter be forgotten and nobody actually, things just move on the way they always have for the last 25 years or so?
I've been around a long time. We've been through many situations like this, although not one quite as bad. In 2007, when the Office of Fair Trading issued their investigation into pharmaceutical pricing, there was an opportunity to put this right. It wasn't taken. In 2010, the incoming Conservative government that ended up being coalition had a manifesto commitment to effectively what I've been talking about. What did that morph into? It morphed into the complete disaster that is the Cancer Drugs Fund, and it morphed into NICE considering wider social benefits, but without looking at opportunity cost. Thankfully, that got killed. We're now at another crossroads where there is an opportunity to do something sensible. Whether that will be taken or not, that's beyond my pay grade, right? Do we think this letter has had impact? We know it has. Will we get a personal reply? I doubt it, but I don't really care about that. I don't have any vanity. I just want to change things for the better. Is this story getting into the press? No. Not right now. Not right now.
Yeah.
Guess what? Right? Guess what? Rich people pay many millions of pounds to buy newspapers. Those newspapers make a loss. Why do they do it? You decide. Journalists build a career on having reliable sources. If you're a journalist who wants to build a career, what should you definitely not do?
You expecting an answer?
Your sources too much.
Amazing.
We live in a democracy. Celebrate it.
Right. Amazing. Thanks. I think I'm just going to cut it there, Karl. I really, really appreciate you taking the time. Thank you so much for jumping onto this call, and yeah, thank you.